Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast. And this week, we are joined by two very special guests. Connor, of course, who has been on the podcast many times, and first-time guest Brett, who you will have seen the other day in our main episode where we talked about the new records from Ghost and Nilufer Yanya. And Brett and Connor have joined me to discuss a very special album today. It's kind of a spiritual sequel video to a video that we did like several months ago with Connor and me and Jake and Morgan on one of my absolute favorite records of all time, Los Campesinos, is Hold On Now Youngster, because we're talking about a band that comes from the same scene as Los Campesinos, who put out the album we're talking about today in the same year as Los Campesinos dropped their two debut opuses. And more pertinently than any of that, an album that is foundational to the personality and music taste of our very own Connor Moritz here with us. So, Connor, I want to throw over to you immediately. How did you discover Johnny Foreigner? Tell us about your relationship with this album and what this record means to you.
The way I remember finding this record was actually, I think it was just through the classic YouTube suggested. I just saw the cover and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. And then I put it on and was just, what? it was one of those moments where it was like, I've never heard anything quite like this, so I don't know what to think of it on first impression. I don't even think I listened to the whole thing because it was just a lot to take in. But I just like that, just the sound of the record just kept playing like back in my mind. And I was like, I should go back to that. And then I listened to it. I was like, this is fucking incredible. And I got into this record actually before I got into Los Campesinos. And this is the reason I got into Los Campesinos, because everyone said it sounded like them. So I was like, oh, I'll check them out. And where to even begin? It's just like a fun blast of a record.
So I think we should say for our listeners that Johnny Foreigner is a Birmingham-based emo indie rock sort of, or emo pop, sort of even twee poppy band. I mean, you could describe them in a lot of different ways. If you know Los Campesinos, you'll be familiar with the sound. They came up around in the same scene, as I already mentioned, and it's worth noting that, and Connor, I'm sure you can probably help me out with this. Is this their third record?
So I always thought it was like their debut, but they actually have a debut back from 2005 that I never knew about until pretty recently, actually. And then if you look at like their Rate Your Music catalog, I think their second album is more like a demo of sorts, whereas the first one is like a self-made lo-fi bedroom type album. But this is like their first, I guess, professional proper release, if you will.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, it is a debut of sorts. I think you might even compare it to like Frightened Rabbit with Sing the Greys versus Midnight Organ Fight. And this is very much this band's Midnight Organ Fight. And what I will say is one of the things that struck me about this, I first listened to this album about, I think 8 or 9 months ago when you recommended it to me. And I was sort of going through a bit of a, like, I was going through a bit of a Los Campesinos phase at that time. And then so I kind of did the opposite of what you did. And I kind of discovered Johnny Foreigner through that band and through you specifically. Although it's worth noting that actually I was obsessed with Los Campesinos at this point, but I still had never heard anything about Johnny Foreigner until your recommendation specifically and seeing it in your like favorite records list. So that I think speaks to a certain level of obscurity that this band have. Los Campesinos I discovered many years ago because for whatever reason, their particular blend of emo pop, twee pop, that was like, you know, very niche and very based within these very specific subcultures in the UK, managed to transcend that environment and make it through to like blogs and magazines and Pitchfork and all these sorts of like established media websites who were able to give Los Campesinos the push towards, you know, American audiences and the mainstream and all sorts of things that they wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise. So Los Campesinos benefited heavily from that. To a certain extent. And it's kind of a shame that Johnny Foreigner didn't seem to benefit from that, considering that they were kind of releasing records like this at the exact same time. So it wasn't as though they were late to the party or anything. It's just that they never quite got cut the same break. And so it's a real shame, because every time I listen to this record, I'm struck by the feeling that, there's no reason why, no logical reason in terms of the musicality of this record, why this shouldn't be bigger, like why this shouldn't be considered on the same level as some of those more breakthrough sort of lo-fi twee emo records of the time. And in many ways, like, while I still, of course, prefer Hold On Now Youngster, one of my absolute favorite records ever, while they are cut from similar niches and similar cloths, the experience and the things that I get out of both of those records are actually quite distinct. Hold On Now Youngster is a kind of emotional whirlwind. So it has these moments of intense, loud, call and response, hand clap shit, like real twee shit. It probably leans harder into the twee than this band do. And it has this kind of ebb and flow to it, that record, these beautiful tender moments, as well as these kind of shout along choruses. With this record, what Johnny Foreigner do is that, with the exception of one track, every single song on here is a shout along, scream along, pile the guitars on, and just like layer different sort of guitar overdubs and have just as much screaming as possible happening at the same time. And so it creates a much more visceral experience than a record like Hold On Now Youngster. It's less compositionally refined. It's less kind of but it has the same sense of great songwriting structure, of the ability to write really fantastic hooks. I might even say that Johnny Foreigner on this record are maybe even better than Los Camp at writing hooks, although it's very close. But the hooks on this record are amazing. The vocal melodies, the ways in which the verses never lose the impact or the energy of the choruses. Like, if you listen to the vocal delivery on these songs, it's not the sense of build up and release. It's the sense, for the most part, of just continued sustained being on this higher level in the intensity. And it gives these songs a dizzying effect in terms of how you experience them when you put the record on. And it's to the record's credit that it never gets exhausting to do that, because they're always hitting you with a new hook or a new kind of melodic idea or a new great riff that just completely keeps you locked in every step of the way. I mean, it's kind of remarkable how good this band are at doing that, especially for a band that are so kind of fresh and just raucous.
It's also worth noting at this point in time, they were only a 3-piece, whereas Los Campesinos with Hold On Now Youngster, were they like what, a 6-7 piece or something like that?
I think so, yeah. Like a lot of members in that band at that time, maybe even more than that. It was like Los Campesinos are this idea of the band as a commune, as a like giant extended family, where everyone is kind of like, like a broken social scene, I think, came up when we talked about that band, and they give off a very similar vibe. But Johnny Foreigner, by contrast, are much more of a sort of conventional band. I mean, you still have that dynamic of the male versus female vocals, which is very much a shared aspect of the sound of both early Los Camp and this record. But you have a more kind of what I would describe as a more sort of focused rock band experience on this record. I don't know. How would you describe it, Connor? Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's not like a wide array of instrumentation as there is on a Los Campesinos album. Like Hold On Now Youngster has like string parts, violin, it has xylophone, keyboard, all that stuff. Whereas this album is almost entirely drum, bass, and guitar based with some Casio keyboard overdubs, which is also worth noting. Actually, the name "Waited Up Till It Was Light" is actually a reference to a band called Casio Tone for the Painfully Alone.
Oh my god, actually, I love that.
Which is the most like indie band name ever. They're
actually
the
most really, like Tweemo band name of all time.
Yeah, they're actually really good though, and they're not even really twee. But I could see why they were influenced, or that band influenced this. All the keyboard parts are pretty much just this cheap church organ setting Casio sound.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the
along with
most
like the
iconic
cheap
parts of
drums
this
too.
record is that
Yeah.
like Casio keyboard sound that starts up Lee Room at the start of this record. Like you immediately hear that and you're like, I know exactly like what this is, where this is from. I know exactly like what I'm going to get from this record. It's very iconic to me when this album starts up. I love that. I love that tone. Like it is
Get
cheap,
on
but like
before
that's
the
why
ship
it
gets
works.
down. It's
Yeah.
so
Get
catchy.
up before the ship sinks. Yeah. Oh my
Uh,
God. What an intro, man. Like 2
This
minutes
is
of just straight fire.
it's such a perfect opener because it just explodes, and then it's just that's the record from there on out. It's just a perfect way to introduce yourself to the band.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah.
gonna move over to you next, Brett, because again, you're
Mhm.
the newest person here to this
Yeah.
record. Essentially, just me saying, "Hey, we're doing this record club. You can check this out if you want. If you want to talk about it with us, if you dig it." So, what was your experience like? What were your expectations, if any, going into this record? And then, what has your experience been listening to it this week?
Well, I'm kind of new to this style. I have listened to Hold On Now Youngster because you recommended it to me, and yeah, I gave it a 9.5 out of 10 because it's near flawless.
Fuck yeah.
And I have never had an experience like that with a rock record. It was just so like rambunctious and like passionate and like hard on sleeve. It was just like, I don't know. It's like really unlike anything that I've ever heard before. And I didn't really know it was kind of going to be the same thing with this album, because I know, Connor, this is your your Twitter abbey, so I know like this is like how I know who you are on Twitter. No, I mean when I put it on, I mean I wasn't really expecting anything. I'd never heard of Johnny Foreigner. Gonna be honest, I just because of the band name, I didn't really expect anything much of it. It's kind of like a straightforward name, but no, when I put this on, I immediately fell in love with it. It was just like it just immediately kick-started, and like I just couldn't get enough of it. Like Lear Room is just such a great way to open it up, because you have like this like playfulness, and then like it just rips open with these like catchy as hell hooks. It's like a real like emotional like punch bag that really just like explodes. I mean, like in the lyrics it says like they're gonna write your name in sparklers, and it just feels like a fireworks show. So I fully enjoyed this. Like each song is just like it's like the same level, but like the guitar playing is just so impressive. I just can't believe like this band is just so like technically gifted, and like I've never heard of them. It's really kind of like a shame that like I like this album is so good, but like nobody really talks about it. Throughout the whole time of this record, I just fell in love with it more. Like each song just keeps getting better every time I listen to it. Like I think like probably my favorite song, or maybe my second favorite song, is the second song, Bipolar Friends. And like you have
Great
like
track.
these like twinkling math rock like ish chords also. It just sounds really pretty and just really like dizzying at the same time. But like I don't know, just like it really just kind of just catches you, and then like you're just like kind of lulled into it, and then all of a sudden it just explodes again, and then like oh man, it's just so good. Like each song kind of does like that throughout the entirety of the record, but like each riff, even though it kind of does sound uniform with the whole record, it sounds distinct in its own way. And it's just like, man, I can really go on about like the guitar playing here, just because like I play guitar myself, and like this just makes me want to learn some of these. It's just so fun. But yeah, this was like a lights out, like near flawless record for me again. I had fun with it so much. I like listen to this on the way to work. I listen to it like while I'm at the gym. Like I listen to it at night. It's just like also like put me in such a good mood every time like I put it on.
Absolutely.
It's so uplifting.
Yeah.
I just feel like a million times better, because like the way that the lead vocalist is just like expressing himself and just saying like these really descriptive details of like city life. Like I think like the line in Lear Room where they says like they're gonna write your name in sparklets. I think that's a really romantic line, and it kind of like has that same theme throughout the whole record.
I'm glad you brought up the romanticism of it actually, and like I think I can sort of shed some light on some of the sort of lyrical context and stuff that's being sort of talked about in this album, because another of the ways in which this band is similar to Los Campesinos is that particularly on both bands sort of 2008 records, they write about similar things, and they very much embrace aspects of the scene that they are coming up through. And it's very much like, let me take one step back actually. both bands, I think, exist in large part because of the explosion of the British post-punk revival in the mid 2000s, and specifically Bloc Party. When Bloc Party released Silent Alarm, there was like a momentous shift in the direction of rock music in the UK, specifically indie rock music as well, because that album was successful, but it wasn't like a massive commercial crossover hit necessarily. But it did kind of define the direction of British rock music in a lot of ways. Even bands as varied as like Arctic Monkeys and stuff. And all of that was kind of foreseen by Bloc Party. And I could say even Arctic Monkeys' first album could even have been influential on the scene that branched out of that too. But like, the point is, there was this explosion in this thing that became to be called the British post-punk revival, which itself was influenced by the New York post-punk revival of the really early 2000s and bands like Interpol and Years and stuff. And so what happens when there's a big sort of cultural explosion in terms of a musical style within a place is you get fringe aspects or like niche variants of that style that grow to have like a smaller audience and a more kind of idiosyncratic approach to that style that's purposefully like alienating to some, like doesn't have the same level of like broad commercial appeal, but also shares a lot in common with some of the more sort of punkier and DIY ethos of like various niches that will have preceded it as well. And so bands like Los Campesinos and Johnny Foreigner, I think, are the logical extension, the logical niche extension of the British post-punk revival mixed with the kind of scrappy club scene, emo, like young kids with guitars just making as much noise as possible. And so as a result of that, a lot of the lyricism on both of those records, and it's maybe even more acute on this one, is specifically about the experience of living within that scene, the intensity of the emotions that you experience as a young person, romantic attachments, the experience of romance as this kind of like intense and fiery and dizzying thing, and the ways in which love and romance and sex and attraction are so deeply tied up in music and music making and music performing as well. There's a lot of meta lyricism on this record, so a lot of lyricism about being a band and about lyricism that sort of comments on in kind of sort of sarcastic and postmodernish ways the band's own existence and their sort of place in the scene. And you have like, I think the definitive text of the this particular niche is Los Campesinos' song "You Me Dancing" off of "Hold On Now Youngster." And what you have with this record is essentially a bunch of songs, over a dozen songs that essentially give you a different take on what that song achieves and the spirit of what that song is all about. So you have songs that are about like, fractious friendships that are falling apart. You have songs that are about, being sad and lonely because this person you love won't sleep with you. And you have songs about sort of playing in the club and just all this sort of stuff. And it is so deeply ingrained within the specific scene that it exists within, a specific sort of Birmingham music scene at this time, that a lot of the more sort of niche references and these aspects of it can kind of fly over our heads as people who don't exist within that scene. But in a lot of ways, the nicheness of that, the specificity of it, makes it sort of like more appealing, gives it a kind of like a feeling of intimacy. Like, as much as these guys are like obviously taking the piss at certain points and just kind of like being totally rambunctious sort of kids, you feel a sort of kinship with them, even if you don't necessarily understand every cultural reference point, like I never do with the soccer references on Los Campesinos records. You just get the feeling of it. And like Our Bipolar Friends, the song you brought up, Brett, is also one of my favorites on the record too. And it has this great lyric. So many great lyrics on this record, but I really love, she says it's written in the stars, but I don't look at the stars anymore. I just want someone to die for. It's like this idea of contrasting the kind of cheesy imagery of, starry-eyed falling in love with the intensity of the kind of burning passion that underlies all of that bleeding heart poetry. It's like, you're the stars, but you're also like, that can't convey how I feel about you. How I feel about you is this kind of like urgent life or death thing. And that's a good way of summing up this whole scene. And this record in particular is that every emotion, every aspect of this is like, it's life or death. Like the way I'm feeling is life or death, even if in reality it's nothing. Like on the third verse of the song, sweetie kids on pills aren't kids anymore. You're 24 and still chewing your inside out. We don't care what your scene's about, so many shows and no one turns out. So like there's this contrast between the intensity and the visceral reality of being in a punk and emo band and being in love and how it's, you know, fucking profound when you're in it, and also like this awareness of the fact that maybe the actual reality of that is you get a bit older and you're severely jaded and you realize like how sort of deluded you are and how embarrassing it is to sort of look at people who are like you or who you were like when you were a bit younger. And so there's this great sort of self-awareness about like how ridiculous this band is and how ridiculous these intense extreme emotions are, but also like we know it's ridiculous and we still lean into it because that it's who we are. And that I think is the ultimate appeal of this band, is that sense of like shamelessness that this music puts across, in the sense of like there's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's just things like embarrassment and defeat and heartbreak and all these sorts of things are inevitable, but like, you know, that's just part of the fucking game. And I just, yeah, I went off there as I typically tend to do, but like that whole vibe is so much of what makes this record so you know, emotional and impactful to me, is like I can connect to that and relate to it.
It's perfectly captured in the music too, as well as the writing. We brought up like Los Campesinos, and I always thought of this band as kind of like or at least this album is kind of a cross between Los Campesinos, Bloc Party, and maybe sprinkle in a little bit of like Fall of Troy or something, just for that kick of energy and technicality that all the band members have. I never really, this is one of my maybe like 5 most played albums ever. But funny enough, I never really like read that much into the lyrics, because if I'm going to be completely blunt, I didn't always care, because they could honestly like just be saying like, I shit my pants today, like over and over throughout the whole album, and I wouldn't
Salt
care
and Pepper
because it's just
Cinderella
such
is
a
literally
blast.
about just salt and pepper.
Yeah. Wait, is
Yeah.
it?
No, it's not. I'm pretty sure it's not.
No, I feel you. Like you're just kind of
Yeah.
taken away and sort of carried by the intensity and the beauty of how it all comes across. And that's absolutely true. Like the way in which this album sustains its energy is like truly remarkable. Like you go from Our Bipolar Friends into Eyes Wide Terrified, which is like such an amazing like back-to-back punch of intensity. And both of those songs are kind of like sound similar to me, and like they almost feel like different versions of the same song musically at certain points. They have this kind of explosive, like repetitive sort of chorus cycling thing. And I particularly like, I get the Your Life is a Song, but not this one refrain stuck in my head. Like I've had it been like humming it to myself all week. I think that refrain and the repetition of that line as well, like you can read into, you know, some of the things I was talking about with in terms of like the scene and the experience of being like in a band and in love, and the only able to see all of the intense things in your life through the lens of music and your art and stuff. And there's just really evocative lyrics here as well, like pulling down the blinds blocks what's left of the stars. So I'm tripping over bottles, tracing footsteps in the dark. Tomorrow would be a good day for broken glass. There are men in this room who would pay for this. Missed calls to say I missed the mornings most. Like it's hard to get a clear, like the point is not like you have a clear understanding or image or idea of what is being sung about there, what Alexi is the front person, right? Yeah, what Alexi is singing about there, but you get it's very evocative all the same. Like there's a lot of lyrics on this record that just like are evocative and especially acquire this power through repetition too. Like I think my favorite song on this record, it's been really hard to call, but my favorite song on this record I think is The End and Everything After. This song is just like absolutely amazing. Like musically, it has this great sort of refrain about like believing in the band and with how fans don't stop believing in bands that they adore even after those bands have clearly stopped believing in themselves. And it's this really funny and interesting idea about like, you know, how, you know, art and artists and bands can like kind of exist through the people that aren't even in the band at certain points. And that's, I think, really a really funny observation, but also like, you know, there's poignancy to it as well, because they double that with lines like careless hands and one night stands where everything stands, we were made of plans, which speaks to like, the band stopped believing in the band, and maybe in part that was because, you know, of the relationships within the band, and of like, you know, the fact that, you know, being friends and maybe even being lovers maybe got in the way of that, and making plans and having these grandiose ideas for what you're going to be, and then those meeting up against like the reality of like, you know, human relationships and shit, and how that can always kind of turn it to, you know, ruin everything. And just like that, where everything stands, we're made of plans line really fucking makes that super poignant. And then you get into the chorus, which is like, again, favorite song on this record, and this is my favorite chorus on this record. Like, this is the one
Amazing
I've been
chorus.
fucking hollering all week long. Backdrops set to falling stars does not describe what you are, and God knows what you think of us.
You think of us.
And that's like, I mean, first of all, backdrop set to falling stars does not describe what you are. That is both like one of the most beautiful and one of the most fucking like tears in my diary emo fucking like lines about being sort of obsessed and besotted with someone. And just like the way in which that immediately becomes like a self-conscious worry about like what this girl might think of his band as he's kind of like obsessed with her. Like, there's just a lot of humor in this record, and like the way in which the lyrics are about like, you know, how much pride and like power and meaning goes into like being in a band when you're like a teenager or in your early 20s, and then how that kind of brushes up against, you know, the self-consciousness of like, fuck, I'm in a band and I'm like screaming and shit, and I'm trying to like, you know, be attractive, but also like, you know, I'm completely unloading the most like myself in maybe the most unattractive of ways. Like, it's, I don't know, it really like, it's really funny and really emotional to me. And like with Los Campesinos, you get these kind of like lyrics that speak to give you a really vivid sense. Like, I've never experienced the Birmingham club scene. Like, I've never really experienced any kind of punk club scene because of where I live. But yet with lines like, now we sleep crooked if we sleep at all, we squeeze our bodies into spaces where the spaces are filled. You are blisters from our shattered arcs across the city, make a new body. And now the pressure's on and I still sleep alone. We barely notice when our friends are gone. We're sharing cigarettes to pass the time. Coward dazed by the money, trapped by community. Like, those lines, like, I've never experienced the kind of dynamic that this band sing about in terms of like, you know, these kinds of intense friendships and relationships and being in a band and all that sort of stuff, and like, you know, going to shows every night and all that sort of shit. But I feel it through the song. And to me, it's like this band's masterpiece of a track. Like, this is the one that completely drives home everything I love about this band. And it's a testament to how good this album is that it's only just my favorite song. And there's a bunch of other fucking contenders. Like, what are some of your guys' like other standouts on this record, like songs that really jumped out to you?
For me, it's the ending. The hidden song at the end of the record is just absolutely perfect. Because like, first of all, like, every time I just hear like the vocal harmonies from the two singers, it's just absolutely gorgeous. I just can't get enough of it. It sounds so good. But then they take it a step further, and then they go in with the all in time, and then they just keep going faster and faster until it just eventually runs out of steam. It just explodes. Eventually, the record explodes pretty much after many fireworks of tracks. It's honestly one of the best ending records I've really heard for any track. It kind of just really encapsulates this record so much that like there really couldn't have been a more perfect ending to this. Like it's just so good.
I love also, like, I hate to keep laboring this comparison, but I love also how like the end of this record also kind of parallels the end of Hold On Now Youngster, where you have this kind of like big climactic song in the penultimate track, and then you have like this extra burst of like instrumental fire and climax in the last song as well that just kind of like pushes it further. I love the idea of ending a record in that way, with like a huge longest track on the record being like this sort of expansive swelling thing, and then you get another fucking song after it that just somehow like keeps a smile on your face and doesn't like feel like it's the record's run out of steam. It's great, a great ending to the record. I totally agree.
One thing about this entire record, like, we've gone on and said how amazing the instrumentation is, Alexei's guitar playing is just incredible, very math rock inspired, and even noise rock
100%.
inspired, all the way through. And it's just like it's so addictive to listen to. And of course, like Kelly's bass playing just carries a lot of these songs, carries a lot of the momentum, and the drumming from Junior is incredible. Just honestly, some of the best drumming I've ever heard on a rock record, if I'm going to be completely honest.
This band is just like so perfectly in sync. Like these stop-start rhythms in some of these songs where they just stop on a dime and then they just keep going, and then they just. And I love, oh man, what song is it? I think it's Cranes, like the Cranes and Cranes song, or it might be The End and Everything, where like they, as he's singing, they stop and then they keep playing as he's doing the lyrics. It's like, it's one of the craziest things that I've ever heard in a song. It's so impressive how they just keep that up. And I bet like when they do it live, it just sounds even better.
That's totally the Bloc Party coming through as well, because like on Silent Alarm, on songs like Helicopter and stuff, like the band do that same trick, and they kind of pioneered it, I think, or at least within this kind of era of music. And so like it always gets me as well. Like it's just like it's the source again, that mathy kind of like really locked in sense of rhythm as well. Like these bands would not work if there was not complete and total synergy. And it's doubly impressive with Johnny Foreigner, I think, because everyone has to be on the same level of intensity for any of these songs to work. And the fact that they all are and they're all able to maintain that is really fucking impressive.
The instrumentation, it's just top notch. The technicality, the energy, just top notch. But when you listen to this like once, it's kind of like a wind turbine to the face, and you might not know what to like make of it. But what like really captures people that I talk to who hear it for the first time is just the energy. But like for me, one of the reasons why this is currently, as it stands, my fourth favorite album of all time, it's only beaten by Frenger's Emergency and I and Clarity. One reason I regard it so highly is because the arrangements here are like so dynamic. Like you were saying, all the starts and stops, like the every single
part.
And exactly.
Like the interplay between Kelly and Alexei, like on the like vocally, and then just all of these switch ups from the drumming to the guitar parts. And I also got to shout out the producer here, because I think the producer goes by the name Machine, who is actually, his resume is quite large, but it's almost entirely metal, which kind of I think that really contributes to the energy of this album, because it does sound huge. It doesn't have that like raw, almost lo-fi sound that Los Campesinos have on their debut, but I think that's to this album's benefit, because all the different like guitar parts where it like will suddenly change to a clean sound, and then all of a sudden you just get hit by this screaming, screeching feedback, not too dissimilar from like an Unwound record. It's just, and the fact that it's all like just so fluid,
great comparison,
just blows me away. It's incredible.
I think the moment where I really realized that, you know, this was more than just like a great sort of emo indie rock band. Like it was more than just like a great example of a band that could just do the whole shouting and intense playing, was when the song Henning's Favorite started. And you get this gorgeous, like effects laden guitar part that I swear to God, the first thing I think of every time I listen to it is Entombed by Deftones. And if you can evoke Entombed by Deftones, which is like one of the 3 greatest Deftones songs on the best Deftones album, if you can evoke that, you have the source. Like you're onto some fucking magic, because that song is one of the greatest songs ever fucking recorded. And it's just this little guitar part at the start and then at the end of the song that evokes that, but it's so strong and it stands in such contrast to what you've come to expect from the style of playing on the record. Like they just know how to introduce something or throw something in there that really makes you realize how dynamic and talented they are as musicians. And I really, really appreciate that. And even this song as well, which is like, I love this song. It's probably like one of my least favorites on the record, which tells you just how much I love this album. But it has this great sort of sentiment about authenticity and sort of like punk and homegrown music scenes, which is like a kind of topic that a lot of these sorts of niche bands rail against, because like the twee emo and then the indie rock emo kind of variants are, I think, get a lot of flack from like emo purists in terms of like being, you know, like I guess too irreverent of a take on the style. And so a lot of these, you'll often see these bands like commenting on that, or like kind of, you know, taking the piss out of it as well. And there's this great lyric in the song: I see the girls at your shows, they wear their battles in their hair. You spend too much time indoors shouting fake at the walls. I thought that wars were fought for this. I guess we lost, at least you know where you stand. Like that sentiment of you spend too much time shouting fake at the walls. I thought that wars were fought for this. Like that to me is like a fucking like a knockout diss of like anyone who's like an authenticity purist, right? Because eventually all that really ends up being is just like self-indulgent whining, basically. Really, it's really anti-music to just whine about authenticity. And this is just a song that is like a really great sort of snotty takedown of that attitude. And I really appreciate it as well. It's a great track.
I love that song too, especially like when you were talking about the entombed like tapped lead part near the beginning. I also just love that bass part because it just like, I don't know how to describe it, but it just like plays for a little bit, then stops, and then comes back in, and it's like,
yeah.
It's, man, this album, like, this is one of the best car albums, let me tell you that.
Absolutely. Like, and again, just on that guitar part note, like a part of the reason why that guitar part in the Deftones song is so iconic is because of the harmonization of the bass, like in that part. And so the bass is such a key component to doing things like that. And again, like you say, it works here because it's not just about let's lay a cool, you know, effects pedal on and do this kind of like dreamy sounding melody. It's about how that's integrated with the bass to give it this sort of additional weight and counterpoint. Really great artistry from a musical construction perspective. Like, and that's one of the things that makes this such a like a rewarding record, is like you could just throw it on and just be so captivated by the noise and raw joy of it, and then you can still like come back to it and get more and more out of like how musically smart and savvy it is too. I think we have to at this point talk about one of the most sort of beloved songs on this record, and one of the kind of most slightest songs on this record, yet ends up having like the biggest impact, which of course is Salt, Pepper and Spinderella.
I don't know exactly why, but it's like by far their most popular song. Like this has on Spotify, looking at the numbers, 1.2 million plays. And then the next most played song is Eyes Wide Terrified, which just has over 200,000.
Wow.
So that's
what?
That's crazy difference. I wonder why that is.
Even though it's not a good representation of what the album sounds like as a whole, I feel like this is a great song to get someone into the band because of its kind of more simplistic style at the start.
Yeah, it has like that pulsing synth.
Yes,
like the drum beat.
Like the like cheap Casio drums too, that like it sounds like cheesy, but just in the best way possible.
The vocal melodies on this song are like some of the catchiest and like most like memorable and kind of just like, oh fuck, on the whole album. Like we've got a place for the night, what are you worried about? Oh fuck, I can't even read the lyrics without sort of like, you know, feeling myself like well up. And it's not even a sad song, it's just an emotional one. To me, like one of the most iconic parts of this entire record is the end of this song, where you have this, you know, this band is incredibly verbose, incredibly like, let's jam as much into every moment of this record as possible. And you just have this blissful fucking ending to the song where it's just like layers of guitar overdubs and just like wordless cooing. And it just ends up being one of the most like profound parts of the whole record in terms of like the emotional impact of it. And it's not even any lyrics to take in, it's just the sounds, the wordless vocals, and fuck man, just complete. And it's such a short song too, it's over so quickly, and yet it's so perfect in every second of it.
It's the perfect centerpiece for this record. Like it's the perfect place to like change things up and be like, oh, you know, like I especially love the spoken word bridge from Alexi, where he just starts like talking almost unintelligibly. It's like hard to hear what he's saying, but then you just hear at the very end, he says, bring out the real fun, turn on the real drums. And then the full band comes in.
And that's
and
like,
I pass out.
Marky Smith stuff.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
spoken word bridge is like, it's definitely a Los Campesinos trick as well. Like they do the same thing on at the end of You Me Dancing,
Yeah.
where like Garrett has this kind of like really fast sort of like spoken word part. So yeah, that's like it's almost like a not a cliche, but it's like a kind of trademark that you will get something like that eventually, like a really intense sort of spoken word, like diary entry type shit. And when it's deployed right, it makes the song like even more powerful.
That guitar lead too. I know I'm gonna say like I'm gonna talk about guitar riffs and leads all over this because like that clean one where it's like
Oh,
just oh god, I get that stuck in my head so often. Like it's man, what a fucking song, man. It's one of the best songs ever written, in my opinion.
it's so fucking good, dude. Like, and I mentioned earlier, like this record just barrels through you constantly, with the exception of one song. And that song, DJs Get Doubts, is like it's so good. Even like though it's like
Underrated.
it's very underrated, I think, based on the ratings, and like it's so good for how like different it is from the rest of the record, for the kind of reprieve that it represents. Like it's just really like where you realize like the power of this band, like the emotional power of this band, doesn't necessarily completely come from the intensity, but also from how tender they can be, and like the tenderness that's always underlying the intensity. And here you strip the intensity back and you just get the tenderness coming through. And it's sad, but it's also like doesn't feel like it diminishes the euphoric experience of the rest of the record either. It's like, yeah, it's just a beautiful little song. And fuck, man.
The strings that come in there too are just gorgeous.
Oh,
Oh man.
And the xylophone too. It's just
that's like a perfect, if you're gonna have an acoustic track on an album like this, you nailed it right there. I love that chorus too, these little white lies, just beautiful harmonies in that. Like it really shows they're like that they're not like that 100% energy all the time. They can really like channel these beautiful guitar and violin arrangements.
And this is like a moment on the record too where like lyrically you get more heavier into the kind of like relationship aspect of some of the storytelling on this record. And what I love about I read a comment that Alexi made on this song where he's like, 3 of my friends have asked if this song is about them, and I said no, but really it's about all 3 of them. When we came to record this, my fingers were all cut up from intense playing, so machine glued them back together with super glue.
Ouch.
I don't even know exactly what that means, but it's a really funny comment. And just the notion that like, the sentiments in the song are just like an amalgamation of all of these intense emotional connections. It feels very true to the kind of, aspect of this band and of the songwriting. And also it leads into my second favorite song on this record, which is, I think, the most romantic song here and one of the most beautiful, in my opinion, which is Sometimes in the Bull Ring. Like this is one of my, it may be going to be one of my favorite like romantic sort of love songs of all time. Like it just has this sense of incredible like emotional tenderness and beauty, and like the lyricism are like kind of poetic in that kind of like love lettery way that's kind of a bit cluey and tacky, but also like delivered and expressed so movingly that it kind of transcends that tackiness. It's at points it's like so on brand as to almost like potentially be read as self-parody, but there's just such beauty in it. One of my favorite lyrical parts on this record is I will wait for you outside car parks, outside busy shopping centers. I will wait for you at work when all your early shifts run late, and sometimes in the bull ring, and always when you're sleeping. I will look at your hands and think I could never explain what you had. Like, fuck me, that's beautiful. Like,
so beautiful. Yeah,
it's gorgeous. And also like another iconic lyric that I think basically sums up this entire band is, I might be drunk, but at least I'm standing up, and in this place gestures are all we've got. Like that idea that your existence and you're so like, the only way you can really express how you're feeling is through gestures that might not mean anything to anyone. It's just the idea of expression, like for the sake of it. And
it's like a different kind of intoxication.
Yeah, and then you have like the just me, her, and a Casio refrain, which is like again super tongue in cheek and like speaks to how the two fixations of Alexei, like his romantic attachments and his music, are like not these distinct parts of his life, but are like deeply intermingled to the extent that that he experiences that his feelings for both of those things are kind of the same. Like he's in love with the music as much as he's in love with the person he's with, or his bandmates even, and it's just like
That
it so melds those things together so beautifully.
Yeah, that line about me and her and a Casio, I always thought was also kind of a meta line, because it's kind of like him saying like me and Kelly, and we got this Casio that we're putting all over the record too. Like it kind of speaks to that as well. I love this song too. It's incredible. But I wanted to real quick talk about what is easily one of my favorite tracks, which is called "Yes, You Talk Too Fast." And
I know that
I
feeling.
as someone who talks slow and talking to someone who talks super fast, I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And that's actually what the song kind of is about. Because I think there's this quote here where Alexi said, she asked me if she talked too fast, and I said no because I didn't hear her properly. And I always felt bad, and that's essentially what the song's about. But the intro of the song, can we talk about that for a second? Because holy shit, the tapped like clean guitar that goes into the distorted parts, and then the vocals that come in just perfectly layered. And then this first verse where he says, there were no female pirates. Your friends are dressed like whores, and there's competitions to see what you're winning. We got short skirts and yo ho ho.
It's so tongue in cheek as
funny.
well. And there's like a similar sense of like kind of like tongue in cheek, like mockery at like audiences and like, people who kind of hop on the bandwagon and like go to shows and don't necessarily take it seriously, or like even the fan communities of bands who are less kind of like who the band don't like essentially. And you're all just jealous, where it's like hot girls know the words to our songs and I'm terrified of what comes next. like that's such a funny lyric to me. I love that sense of like self mocking humor, but also like it's a little bit kind of vindictive and snarky as well. It's really cheeky, but the band gets away with it, I think, and it's really like amusing to me, and I like that aspect of the band. I think I've basically touched on just about everything that I want to touch on. One more thing I will mention, though, is, and this could be a good selling point for Morgan if he hasn't heard this yet, is that this album is engineered and mixed by Will Putney, who is an incredibly important name behind the boards in a lot of sort of metalcore and hardcore bands. He was behind the boards on Every Time I Die's Low Teens. He's produced records for Counterparts and Knocked Loose and a bunch of other bands from that sort of scene. And so while this was very much like preceded all of that, I think that gives you an idea of the kind of combination of sounds or like intensity and impact and musical production that this band are channeling. And if you like Every Time I Die, if you like Counterparts, I mean, shit, Every Time I Die, like now that I think about it, they feel like a kind of more refined version of this band in some ways. But if that sort of shit appeals to you, then this kind of shit is what you want to get on. I think that following and diving into like mixers and engineers and producers can be a really good way of like discovering bands that might be a bit under the radar, because you have some expectation of the general sound you might be expecting. But anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because shout out to Will Putney, man. He's really fucking good at what he does.
This album is so consistently perfect that it's one of those albums. Yeah, even like some of my most favorite albums, I can choose one song. Like, oh, okay, this is my number one. This album, I don't know, but Absolute Balance, man, like that might be my favorite, because it's less of like a, compared to the other songs, it doesn't really have verse, pre-chorus, chorus, like more traditional structure. It's mostly like just a guitar freak out. And the way the Casio keyboard line, that's just so addictive, the do 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 do, and the piano that comes in that like plays along, kind of harmonizes with it, just so beautiful. And then the lyrics, which are basically just like distantly shouted and screamed, which Alexia said a lot of the words are mostly vomit singing. I would just make up on the spot about the gig we were playing. So it was a bit weird having to make up stuff for the album that was like a conclusion. Record collection, shoes, haircut, says everything about someone I'd want to know. And yeah, it's just a perfect, like, even though it's not the closing track technically, it's just such a perfect like penultimate track to me, because every single like moment of guitar lead, of feedback, of intensity, and yeah, it's one of those songs that I would say that you just have to hear it to believe it, because it's just a mind-blowing experience. Also, fun fact, this shirt, the lyrics here are from Absolute Balance here.
Sick. That's awesome.
That's so cool.
Yeah, Absolute Balance is the kind of like climactic point that a record like this deserves, and that when you're listening to it, you hope that it'll have, and then it does. And it's just like, it's the, you know, I remember the first time I listened to this, I was like, can they keep this up? Like after about 5 or 6 tracks, I was like, can they really like keep this up? Is this going to flag in the second half? I mean, how can it not? And then it just doesn't do that. Like it just like they get away with it. They keep that up. And then with songs like Absolute Balance, they introduce a sense of like, you know, it's the longest track on the album. They introduce a sense of like, you know, expansiveness and really like creating a climax and an intensity through space and time. In a way they don't do as much earlier in the record, that really shows you, again, like how those sort of really eccentric and dreamy guitar parts that come in certain songs also show you that this band is more than you expect, and they have a lot of talent and ability, and then they know how to deploy it to just absolutely keep you hooked. It's a perfect record. It took me a while to really feel that, but now I really do. Like I've completely fallen head over heels for this, and it's going to be a regular and important part of my life, I think, going forward, and I'm so excited about that. Like, yeah,
it's one of those albums that you're just shocked that more people don't know about. But I have noticed recently that I think some people are, well, especially like people that I know and that see my profile picture, of course, like a lot of people have started to take note, and I feel like time will tell, but I kind of have a feeling that this could be definitely a cult classic, especially with like online music circles, in a similar way that a band like the Brave Little Abacus is, although maybe not quite that far. And actually I know like some people who absolutely love the Brave Little Abacus and then check this out and absolutely love it as well. Shout out Tame Coffin on Twitter and Rate Your Music.
I think they have very similar they would have a very similar appeal. I think the difference is that, you know, so much of this sort of cult sort of endurance, like people's awareness, is sort of culturally based. And I think the disadvantage the band has is that they're not American. That's really the thing that, and it sucks to say something like that, but I think that really is what it is. I think that if more people heard this band, they would fall in love with them, especially people who do like acts like Brave Little Abacus. But the disadvantage is the sort of cultural gap. And, you know, you would hope that in the internet age that would be easier to bridge, but like in websites like Rate Your Music, these bands consistently underperform. And it's weird, like, when I listen to these records, I feel like this should be the sort of thing that this kind of online internet community absolutely froths at the mouth over. And yet there's this weird sort of disconnect where it doesn't seem to really fully make the crossover. And maybe it's just because like it happened at a time in the late 2000s where it was just like a little too early to really have its moment like that. But I don't know, maybe it will eventually. Maybe people will start discovering this band and they will kind of start accruing a bit more cred and just more listeners in general. But I mean, hopefully that some people check this album out purely because we made this video. That's the biggest hope that I have. So yeah, we'll see what happens. But obviously this gets our highest endorsement.
Mm-hmm. Very last thing I'll say is that this album is just, it's kind of the perfect blend of all of the Connor Core specific genres that I like emo, pop punk, post hardcore, math rock, indie pop. Like it's just everything that I like in those like specific genres, all those amazing qualities put into one fluid masterpiece. And if this band counts as pop punk, then I'm comfortable in saying that they're the best pop punk band of all time, in my opinion, which is a bold statement if they count, that is. But
I would agree with that.
If there's anything that this band should be
yeah.
inspiring, that we should be doing, is making bold statements, because that kind of like extremity and intensity is what this kind of music is all about. So fuck yeah. Absolutely.
Like I said, number 4, my 4th favorite album of all time. I'm not capping.
You're not playing. Yeah, exactly.
Not playing here.
All right, so let's go and give our favorite tracks and rate this bad boy. I'll go first, I suppose. My 3 favorite tracks are going to be The End and Everything After, Sometimes in the Bull Ring, and my third pick is going to be, this is really tough. I am actually not at all sure what to pick. I'll say Eyes Wide Terrified, but it really could be a number of different ones. Least favorite track does not exist. Like there's absolutely nothing that could remotely qualify, to be honest. I could rank all the songs, but I'm not going to. They're just all great. And I'm as surprised as anyone to really fully be comfortable giving this album a 10 out of 10.
Let's go.
Awesome. Brett, do you want to go next?
Yeah, why not? My favorite tracks are Bipolar Friends, the hitting ending at the end of the record, and Salt, Pepper, and Spinderella. Least favorite, I mean, I don't really think I have one. I mean, if maybe I had to pick one, it would be maybe DJs Get Doubts, but like maybe. But yeah, Near Flawless, 9.5 out of 10.
I could just say like every track is my favorite and like equally, and it's probably true. But if I condense it down, I'm going to say Absolute Balance, Salt, Pepper, and Spinderella, and Yes, You Talk Too Fast. Least favorite is, and my rating is 11 out of 10.
All right.
You can just say 10, but it's truly an 11 in my heart. So
well, then from the 3 of us, that gives Johnny Foreigner's Waited Up Till It Was Light an average rating of 9.8.
yes.
All right.
Go.
So if you've heard this record at home, let us know what you think of it. If you haven't heard this record, what the fuck are you still doing here? Go and listen to this fucking record. Check this out and let us know what you think. We want to hear from you in the comments below. We really appreciate any and all comments that we get. If you enjoyed the video, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, then make sure you give the podcast a 5-star rate and review, and check out the YouTube page where you can like the video, and you can also subscribe to us as well if you have not already done that. That is super helpful to us, all of those things. And if you want to go above and beyond and you want to really support the channel, you can hit the join button on our YouTube page. And for just $1 a month, you can support the channel, get your name featured in the title call of every video on this channel, plus also get priority comment response. And if you want to give us a recommendation of something to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Energizer. It just keeps going and going and going.